If I wish to humble anyone, I should question him about his prayers. I know nothing to compare with the topic for its sorrowful confessions. Okay, that is a wildly striking quote from a 19th century leader named C.J. Vaughan, and honestly, it sets the stage perfectly for our explainer today. We're looking at a deeply profound, pretty challenging piece of source material that completely redefines what it actually means to lead.
So it makes you wonder, right? How would you answer that kind of question? Let's dive in and explore how author R. Kent Hughes, in his work Disciplines of a Godly Man, breaks down the really intense internal preparation and the heavy external cost required for true spiritual leadership. When you're asked about the state of your own internal disciplines, what's your answer? It's the kind of question that forces us to look right past our public achievements and straight into our private, everyday habits. To really unpack the source's deep dive into leadership, we're going to build an inside-out framework. We'll be moving sequentially from the private, totally hidden soul of a leader all the way out to their most difficult public challenges in the real world. Because, as you'll see, this isn't about clever management tactics. It's about the very core of who a person is. Here is our roadmap for the explainer. First up, preparing for spiritual leadership. Then, character of a godly leader. Third, the cost of ministry. Fourth, discipline to labor, and finally, reaching across barriers. Let's jump right into Section 1, preparing for spiritual leadership and the internal groundwork required.
Before anyone steps onto a stage or leads a movement, there is an absolute foundation that has to be built. The source insists this begins with private devotion and prayer. To really grasp this groundwork, think back to the biblical account of Joshua fighting the Amalekites. You've got Joshua down there in the valley, right, in his fighting prime, swinging the sword. But up on a nearby hill is Moses, an 80-year-old man, holding up the staff of God in intercessory prayer. Whenever Moses' hands lowered from sheer fatigue, Joshua started losing. When Aaron Hor helped hold Moses' hands up, Joshua won. The text points out that Joshua learned a literally unforgettable lesson that day. The real power in his battle wasn't his own sword or his military genius, it was the intercessory prayer happening above him. And this idea builds into what the author calls a grand visionary chain. The source makes this absolutely fascinating claim: a leader's capacity to lead is directly fueled by their expanding vision of God's vastness. Historically, we see Moses viewing God's glory on Sinai. Later, Joshua meets the warrior captain of the Lord's host right on the eve of battle. Young David stares at the stars, realizes the immensity of God, and suddenly a giant like Goliath doesn't look so terrifying, right? Isaiah sees the Lord on a throne and instantly volunteers, "Send me." And the apostles witness Jesus transfigured. The main point here is that an immense vision is the catalyst for spectacular leadership. But along with prayer and vision, the source emphasizes that true leadership demands a really deep, lingering devotion. The text paints this picture of Joshua in the tabernacle with Moses. Even after Moses leaves, Joshua just refuses to leave the tent. He is so overcome that he just lingers there in the presence of the divine. The author actually compares this to Mary of Bethany, who sat totally enraptured, refusing to leave the room where Jesus was. Recognizing that great historical leaders like Martin Luther and John Wesley shared this exact same trait is key. They demanded to be closeted with God. There is no spiritual leadership, the text argues, apart from this passionate devotion.
Moving right along to Section 2, character of a godly leader and the traits that emerge from preparation.
The crucial point is that this deep, private, internal preparation inevitably produces some very specific and honestly highly countercultural character traits when that leader finally steps out into the open. First is magnanimity. The source defines this as the big-hearted ability to live for a higher glory without a hint of self-promotion. It points out that in the historical texts, Joshua was consistently known simply as the servant of Moses. He was completely fine being a subordinate. The text humorously but profoundly notes that playing second violin is way harder to master than playing first chair, but Joshua was a virtuoso second fiddle. Great leaders actually thrill at the elevation of others and are perfectly willing to be number 2, 3, or 4. Furthermore, the text asserts that these leaders develop a faith that absolutely towers over their contemporaries. Think of Joshua and Caleb. Out of 12 spies sent to reconnoiter the Promised Land, 10 came back terrified. Joshua and Caleb stood completely alone against the majority consensus, insisting they could succeed.
The author draws a sharp parallel to today, noting that we live in a time where truth is so often determined by consensus. Everybody is doing it. But a true leader refuses to conform to the crowd. They are fueled entirely by their reliance on the fullness of the Spirit, even if it literally means standing totally solitary. And this illustrates one of the most liberating, yet entirely humbling, concepts in the source material: embracing your total expendability as a leader. The author notes a harsh but beautiful reality. God doesn't actually need any of us. The text playfully points out that God has literally used donkeys to proclaim his word. So even the greatest leaders, like Moses, have to realize they are ultimately unnecessary, yet graciously chosen. When a leader fully grasps their own expendability, it just destroys their ego. They stop taking themselves so seriously, they start delegating, they build consensus, and they lead by pulling people along rather than pushing them. Okay, before we transition to the second half of our framework, let's do a quick recap of the 6 sweat-inducing commitments for leadership preparation we've just unpacked: intercessory prayer, a growing vision of God, devotion, magnanimity, transcendent faith, and embracing your expendability. And the text explicitly says these are things we must truly sweat for. Now we reach section 3, the cost of ministry and the reality of an enlarged heart. What exactly happens when a person with this meticulously prepared character steps out into the actual gritty work of ministry? The answer is profound, and it centers entirely around the concept of the heart. The author draws a stark, really uncomfortable contrast here. If your goal in life is to dodge trouble, the formula is simple: cultivate a small heart. Avoid entangling relationships, wear blinders to the world's ugliness, and stay deaf to its discord. You will be safe and you will be protected. But if you want to leave a mark on the world, you absolutely must cultivate a ministering heart. This opens you up, makes you completely vulnerable, and makes you susceptible to profound sorrow while simultaneously allowing you to possess true joy. To anchor this heavy concept, the text shares the vivid diaries of James Gilmore, a pioneer missionary to Mongolia. Listen to this opening entry upon his arrival. It is just brimming with hope and eager anticipation. Several huts in sight. When shall I be able to speak to the people? O Lord, suggest by the Spirit how I should come among them, and in preparing myself to teach the life and love of Christ Jesus. He is literally begging for the opportunity to speak to the people and share love with them. This is the exact sound of a fully engaged, ministering heart. But then, skip to the sunset of his grueling career, and we see this absolutely devastating entry. In the shape of converts, I have seen no result. I have not, as far as I am aware, seen anyone who even wanted to be a Christian. The text calls these words pathos-filled and says they just ooze his life's blood. The pain is so palpable. If he had listened to his friends, he could have stayed in comfortable England. Instead, he went to a hostile land and experienced unimaginable heartache. And that brings us to the source's unavoidable spiritual axiom: enlarge your heart, discipline yourself for ministry, and you will enlarge your experience of pain. The author is crystal clear here. No one has ever cultivated a ministering heart and lived to tell of a life of ease. Caring deeply essentially guarantees suffering, but it is simultaneously the only path to a life of true joy and purpose. Which naturally brings us to section 4, disciplined to labor, looking at the physical reality of service. Because if a ministering heart cares this much, it's going to work itself to the bone. Let's examine the intense physical and mental labor demanded by this kind of leadership. The text uses a deeply relatable image to illustrate this: an utterly exhausted Jesus wearily resting by Jacob's well in Samaria at midday. He had been ministering to multitudes, walking dusty roads, with nowhere to lay his head. The source points out that mental fatigue and physical weariness had met, and he plopped down motionless. He was at the absolute edge of his physical capacity. He could have just closed his eyes when the Samaritan woman approached, but instead he mustered the strength to minister. The reality, as the text so bluntly states, is that the world, including the church, is run by tired people who are willing to exert themselves. America is run by tired politicians, wars are won by exhausted generals, and the church is ministered to by tired leaders. Why? Because they're willing to put themselves out to accomplish their tasks. The Apostle Paul labored and toiled night and day, often going without sleep. Martin Luther worked so hard he reportedly didn't change his sheets for an entire year. And the famous evangelist D.L. Moody, his bedtime prayer was simply, "Lord, I'm tired. Amen." So relatable, right? The big takeaway here is that if you aren't being inconvenienced or fatigued by your commitments, you might just be deluding yourself about having a ministering heart. All right, final section, section 5, reaching across barriers, the crowning glory of leadership. We've gone from the secret place of prayer to the formation of character to the willingness to suffer and exhaust oneself. Now, how does this laboring heart interact with a fractured world? Well, the explanator points back to that exact moment at the well. Jesus didn't just minister while tired, he initiated a conversation with a Samaritan woman, despite intense cultural norms. The text highlights that the hatred between Judea and Samaria was incredibly deep, stemming from a daunting 400-year history of deep-seated racial and religious hatred over temple worship. Jews looked down on Samaritans with absolute disgust. Yet Jesus boldly hurdles this conventional barrier to speak to her. The author considers this bold act to be one of the crowning glories of leadership, modeling the absolute necessity of crossing ethnic, social, economic, and psychological dividing walls to actually reach people.
And that leaves us with the ultimate question from the source material, capturing the essence of this entire explainer. The author gives us this incredibly compelling analogy. You can stay off the baseball field, and you will guarantee you'll never strike out, but you'll also never hit a game-winning home run in the bottom of the ninth. You can totally refuse to climb the mountain to avoid getting scraped up, but you'll never, ever see the breathtaking alpine view from the peak. So as we wrap up, think about the framework we've just uncovered. Will you play it safe and stay off the field, or will you step up to the plate and risk the pain of an enlarged heart?